It's the year 1396, and you stand in the echoing stone halls of Westminster Abbey. The air is chilly, and every breath you take turns white in front of you. Your hands grip your prayer book tightly as you watch servants rushing around, setting everything in place for what people are already calling the strangest royal wedding England has ever seen. The bride has just arrived from France, a princess, the daughter of King Charles himself. You've spoken blessings at many weddings before, joining couples together before God, but nothing has ever felt quite like this. When the heavy wooden doors swing open, you find yourself staring in disbelief. King Richard II, almost 30 years old, looks every bit the king tall noble, his golden hair glowing in the colored light from the stained glass windows. But beside him walks a figure so small, she barely reaches his arm. Her tiny hand is swallowed up inside his gloved palm. She can't be more than 6 or 7 years old. The little girl is dressed in an elegant French gown, her dark hair pulled into braids decorated with pearls that seem far too heavy for her small head. You press your hand against the altar rail to steady yourself. This child is Isabella of Valois, and she is about to be crowned Queen of England. You've seen young brides before, girls of 12 or 13, given in marriage to secure power, but never one this young. Still, you understand the times. People do not live long, sickness strikes without warning, and only 50 years ago, the Black Death wiped out half the kingdom. Kings and queens marry to protect their thrones and seal peace between nations, not for love. As the ceremony begins, you glance at Isabella's face. She does not look frightened. Instead, her wide, curious eyes take in everything around her. The towering arches, the glowing candles, the nobles shimmering in silk and velvet. When Richard speaks his vows, his tone is gentle, almost fatherly. He does not seem like a man taking a child for selfish reasons, but rather a ruler doing what must be done to keep peace with France. Everyone knows the marriage will not be made real until Isabella is older. For now she will live in England, raised and taught at court until she comes of age. Still, as you speak the blessing that makes them husband and wife, your heart beats strangely. This tiny girl is now Queen of England, and you cannot help but wonder what her future will hold in the dangerous world of royal power. Before we go deeper into Isabella's story of survival and struggle, let me pause. If you enjoy uncovering these hidden pieces of history, go ahead and tap that like button and subscribe for more tales like this. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing that we're sharing these stories together across time and across the world. This wedding was never meant to be a love story. It was a careful political move, part of the long chess game of medieval Europe, meant to bring peace to a continent torn apart by the 100 Years' War. To understand Isabella's fate, we need to look at the world she was born into and the family that shaped her life. She came into the world on November 9, 1389, inside the Grand Louvre Palace in Paris. She was the eldest daughter of one of France's most troubled kings. Her father, Charles VI, suffered from terrifying bouts of madness. Some days he was a kind, capable ruler. Other days he forgot who he was, believed his body was made of glass, or refused to bathe for months. Imagine little Isabella growing up in that world, surrounded by riches and splendor, yet never knowing what mood she might find her father in. One day he might hold her close and shower her with gifts, and the next he could be lost in a storm of confusion. One day little Isabella might see her father huddled in a dark corner, shouting that killers were chasing him. Another day he could stand stiff as a statue for hours, convinced his body was made of glass and would shatter if he dared to move. Whenever these episodes took over, the palace servants quickly whisked the children away, but the fear stayed in Isabella's wide eyes. Her mother, Queen Isabella of Bavaria, was strong and determined, doing everything she could to hold France together when her husband's mind slipped away. Clever and ambitious, she also understood the value of her children. To her, Isabella was not just a daughter, but a precious bargaining chip whose beauty and royal birth could one day secure an alliance that France desperately needed. The world Isabella grew up in was full of fighting and unrest. For more than half a century, England and France had been locked in the 100 Years' War, a bloody struggle that burned villages, drained treasuries, and left both nations weary. What had started as a quarrel over who had the right to rule France had grown into a long and complicated battle for power, wealth, and identity. By the time Isabella was a little girl, both sides were desperate for peace. But peace couldn't come from words alone. It needed something stronger, like a marriage that tied two nations together. That's where Isabella, barely 6 years old, became part of a plan that would change history. In 1395, secret talks began between French and English envoys. England's King Richard II had lost his beloved wife, Anne of Bohemia, the year before. Anne, remembered as Good Queen Anne, was adored by the English for her kindness and generosity. Her sudden death from plague broke Richard's heart and left him without a child, a dangerous situation for any king. His advisors urged him to take another bride quickly, but Richard resisted. His love for Anne had been real, unusual for a royal marriage, and the thought of replacing her felt like betraying her memory. Still, he knew his duty to England came before his grief. So when France made an offer, Richard listened. The French proposal was bold. They would give him their king's eldest daughter in marriage, along with a staggering dowry of 800,000 francs, enough money to restore England's struggling finances. Even more tempting, they promised a truce, lasting 28 years, long enough for an entire generation to grow up without hearing the clash of swords. There was one problem: Isabella was only 6 years old, far younger than most royal brides. Yet French negotiators argued that this made her the perfect symbol of a fresh start. She would grow up in England, learning its language and customs, so that by the time she became queen, she would feel as much English as French. Richard's council was split. Some praised the plan, pointing to the fortune it would bring, and the chance to redirect England's strength toward threats in Scotland and rebellions in Ireland. Others were uneasy, fearing that marrying a child so young would spark outrage, even in a world where politics often outweighed personal lives. But Richard himself was drawn to the offer, not only for the truce and the treasure, but for something else entirely. When King Richard was first shown the tiny painted portrait of Isabella sent by the French envoys, those watching swore. His stern face softened. This wasn't just a treaty on paper. It was a little girl who would need care, patience, and protection. Some whispered that the childless king saw in her not only a future queen, but a chance to act as a father as well. As a husband. The negotiations dragged on for months, with messengers riding back and forth across the channel, arguing over every little detail of Isabella's new life. It was written down that she could keep her French ladies and servants, follow her own customs, and write letters home whenever she wished. Most importantly, the treaty clearly promised that the marriage would remain unconsummated until she was old enough to safely grow into her role as queen. Meanwhile, back in Paris, Isabella was just 6 years old, more interested in her dolls than politics. While men in fine robes argued over her future in smoky council halls, she was being taught simple English words by her tutors and fitted with gowns meant for royalty. To her, the idea of marrying a king across the sea felt no more real than the fairy stories her nurses whispered at night. The wedding was so important that it had to be held twice. The first took place on October 31st, 1396, when Isabella was only 7 years old. The location was Calais, an English stronghold on French soil, chosen carefully so neither side felt like they were giving in to the other. Inside the stone hall of Calais Castle, the child bride appeared in a gown of golden fabric so heavy with pearls and embroidery that attendants had to help her move. Richard knelt down to her level as they exchanged rings, gently lifting her chin when she shrank back from the staring nobles. Witnesses noticed the tenderness in his gesture, a moment of kindness amid the stiff formality. A year later, Isabella's coronation in London drew crowds so massive that several people reportedly died in the crush to see her. The English public was curious about their child queen, and her arrival was turned into a grand spectacle. She was carried through the city streets in a litter decorated with English roses and French fleur-de-lis, symbols of the fragile peace between the two nations. A small crown, crafted to fit her head, glittered above her braids, and noble women of England walked beside her, holding her long train and serving as her new guardians. The people shouted blessings she could barely understand, but she smiled and waved as she had been carefully taught. The 3-day coronation feast that followed was filled with jugglers, musicians, and plays predicting a bright future for both kingdoms. At the high table, Isabella sat beside Richard, politely nibbling at her food with the manners drilled into her by her French tutors, while lords and ladies lifted their cups to toast the health of their young queen. Yet behind the cheer, more seasoned courtiers exchanged wary looks. They knew how easily truces could break, no matter how many seals and signatures were pressed into them. Richard himself was not loved by all. Many nobles muttered that he leaned too heavily on his favorites and gave up too much in pursuit of peace with France when England's armies were still strong. For the time being, though, Isabella was safe, her place at Richard's side secured in the glittering but dangerous world of the English court. Isabella was given her own set of rooms in Westminster Palace, filled with attendants carefully chosen to mix French familiarity with English traditions. Her daily routine quickly became structured with lessons, not only in music, languages, and reading, but also in the careful manners expected in England's royal court. She practiced lowering herself in the English style of curtsy, learned to prefer wine instead of the ale her French nurses offered, and worked on speaking with the polished accent used by the English nobility rather than the softer tone of her homeland. Richard showed genuine concern for her well-being, often visiting her chambers with tokens of affection. He brought her rare birds from across the sea, beautifully made books copied by Oxford scholars, and finely crafted instruments from London's best workshops. Chroniclers recorded that he seemed happiest in her company, and Isabella soon welcomed his visits with a blend of formality and warmth unusual for such a young bride. Life at court included more than teachers and attendants. The royal household was crowded with children of noble families who were raised close to the king. Isabella was quickly drawn into their circle, especially with Margaret Holland, the lively daughter of one of Richard's half-brothers. Margaret, a little older, guided Isabella through the confusing, unspoken rules of the English court. She taught her songs and games, pointed out which ladies-in-waiting could be trusted, and spoke openly about the rivalries between powerful families. The two spent long afternoons in the palace gardens, sewing side by side, while Margaret explained how ancient feuds between nobles shaped the present. Isabella often asked sharp questions, wondering why the English lords always seemed so watchful. Margaret explained that Richard's rule had been marked by disputes with his barons, who believed he leaned too heavily on his chosen favorites and refused to share power. The peace treaty with France made through Isabella's marriage helped him, yet some saw it as weakness, proof that Richard preferred compromise over victory in battle. Isabella listened closely, realizing with growing awareness that her life was tied to struggles much greater than her own. She started noticing the way nobles fell silent when Richard appeared, or how conversations changed when she entered a chamber. Even her French companions, usually relaxed, grew cautious when political matters came up. During the years 1397 and 1398, her world felt more settled. Isabella grew taller, more confident, and more fluent in English. The cold, towering walls of Westminster, which had once felt so overwhelming, became familiar corridors she could move through without hesitation. Richard continued to treat her gently, more like a protective father than a husband, and she began to feel a sense of belonging in England. Her studies stretched beyond the expected skills of needlework and music, showing her that her future role would demand far more than simple accomplishments. Richard was determined that Isabella would grow up well educated, so he made sure she learned to read and write in both French and English, with some of the best teachers he could find. Her lessons included history, where she studied the lives of past kings and queens who had shaped both England and France. What fascinated her most, though, were the maps. Her teacher, a kind scholar named Master William, often rolled out huge parchments across the floor of her study. Together, they bent over the maps as he explained how rivers, mountains, and seas had steered the wars and friendships of past centuries. Isabella would trace coastlines with her small finger, imagining fleets of ships carrying soldiers, merchants, or messengers across the channel. "Look here, Your Grace," Master William would say, pointing to the narrow stretch of water between Dover and Calais. "This short distance has divided us for ages, yet your marriage is meant to make it a bridge instead of a wall." Even at only 8 years old, Isabella nodded with seriousness, sensing that she stood for something much larger than herself. She wasn't just a child learning lessons, she had become a living sign of peace in a world used to bloodshed. Yet, she would soon learn that symbols could be fragile in the stormy world of medieval politics. The first hints of trouble came in early 1399. Isabella noticed that when she entered a room, conversations stopped more quickly than before. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered nervously when they thought she wasn't watching, and even her trusted friend Margaret Holland seemed distracted, though she tried to carry on their normal play and lessons. Richard, too, seemed changed. He no longer visited her rooms with books, pets, or little treasures. Instead, he often gazed out the window toward the Thames, lost in thought, as though expecting something or someone on the horizon. Isabella wondered if she had upset him, but the truth was far greater than anything a child could have caused. Richard's throne was in danger. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, whom he had banished the year before, had returned to England with an army. He claimed he wanted only his family lands back, but it was clear he meant to take much more. Many nobles, frustrated with Richard's rule, quickly sided with Henry. The sense of safety Isabella had begun to feel at court vanished almost overnight. The reality struck her hard one morning when she discovered that several of her English attendants had quietly left in the night. Her French servants avoided her questions, but their worried faces told her enough. By afternoon, the shouts of armed men echoed through the courtyard below her windows. Curious and frightened, she peeked out to see soldiers she did not recognize, their livery strange and unfamiliar. That evening, Margaret burst into her chamber, her face pale with terror. "You must pack quickly," she urged in a trembling whisper. "Only what you truly need. We're leaving tonight." Isabella's heart pounded. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. Margaret hesitated before replying. "To the Tower. The king says it is for your protection." But she didn't finish the thought, and Isabella already understood. The Tower of London could be both a royal home and a prison, and in dangerous times, the line between the two often disappeared. Their journey through London was unlike anything Isabella had experienced before. Gone were the bright, joyful parades and processions she had known. Instead, her litter was surrounded by grim-faced guards, their swords glinting in the torchlight. The curtains were pulled shut, hiding her from sight, but she could hear the city outside angry shouts, hurried footsteps, and the restless noise of a capital on edge. The noises drifting through the streets were no longer the usual mix of trade and laughter, but carried a sharper edge, filled with hurried steps and voices that spoke of unrest. Inside the tower, Isabella was placed in rooms that seemed fine at first glance, but it soon became clear they were meant to confine her, not comfort her. The tall windows were secured with iron, and guards watched closely at every door. A handful of her French ladies stayed by her side, but nearly all of her English attendants were dismissed. For the first time since her arrival in England, Isabella felt the sting of real loneliness. On the second day, Richard came to visit, and what she saw unsettled her deeply. The king she remembered as calm and full of warmth now appeared worn and defeated. His clothes were creased, his hair was wild, and his tired eyes carried a restless look that reminded Isabella of the unstable moods her father had once shown. He knelt before her chair, as he had when they first met, and spoke in a heavy voice. "My child, times have turned against us. There are men who doubt my crown, men who want to undo the peace we built with France." At 9 years old, Isabella had grown sharper than when she first came to England, and she asked plainly, "Are you still king?" Richard's lips curved into a weary smile. "For now," he answered, "but Henry Bolingbroke has gathered many to his side, and I may not hold the power to shield you as before." Their talk that day was unlike anything they had shared in the past. Richard no longer treated her as a little girl, but as someone who needed to hear the truth. He explained how Henry was pressing his claim, how the lords had deserted him, and how both England's future and the fragile peace with France now hung in danger. Isabella's young voice was steady when she asked, "What will happen to me?" Richard's reply was strained and full of grief. "I do not know." She could see the weight of that answer in his face. Henry might try to use her as leverage with her father, or he might respect her place as queen. Much depended on whether he chose ambition over peace. It was Isabella's first true glimpse into the harsh reality of power, where her worth was measured more as a symbol than as a person. The days that followed dragged by in heavy silence. She heard the faint sounds of London life beyond the Tower walls, but no clear news reached her ears. Her French attendants whispered in low voices, yet their words carried only fragments of gossip. Then, on a dull October morning, Isabella's heart froze as she heard the heavy tread of unfamiliar soldiers approaching. When the doors swung open, she saw not the guards she had known, but new men wearing the red rose emblem of Henry Bolingbroke. Behind them came a tall, commanding figure, dressed like a soldier, yet watching with the keen, careful gaze of a ruler. It was Henry himself, now Henry IV of England, come to see the young queen whose presence could shape his reign. Rising from her seat, Isabella lowered into a graceful curtsy, just as she had been taught. Henry looked her over in silence, taking in her composure and the sharp intelligence in her eyes, already weighing what she might mean for his rule. "Your Grace," he said formally, still granting her the title of queen, "I regret that we must discuss your place under such unsettled conditions." Isabella, direct as always, lifted her head and asked without hesitation, "And where is the king?" Henry looked her straight in the eye and said quietly, "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king. He has stepped down so that I may take the throne." By using Richard's birth name instead of his title, Henry made it clear the crown had already changed hands. Isabella was sharp enough to know step down really meant he had been forced out, but she didn't argue. Instead, she asked, the only thing that truly mattered to her in that moment, "What will happen to me?" The new king's reply would decide whether she would continue to be treated as a queen or become little more than a valuable hostage. Henry's answer was cautious. "That depends on many things," he explained. "On how your father reacts to recent events, on the advice of my lords, and on how you conduct yourself in the coming months." With those words, Isabella, only 9 years old, realized she was entering the most dangerous chapter of her life. The safety she had once known at Richard's court was gone, replaced by fear and uncertainty inside a kingdom being reshaped around her. She was no longer just a child being raised to fulfill her duties. She was now a prisoner whose worth was tied to questions of war and peace. The weeks after Richard's downfall became a test of survival. Though kept inside the tower, she wasn't thrown into a cell, but her freedom was tightly controlled. Debates raged around her fate. Some of Henry's men argued she should be sent back to France at once, to cut costs and show strength, by renegotiating the peace treaty from a clean slate. Others insisted she should remain in England under close guard, believing her presence gave Henry powerful leverage. As long as Isabella was in his care, her father would hesitate to take any action that could endanger her safety. Through it all, Isabella showed remarkable composure for a child. She was polite to everyone, never openly defiant, and careful not to give even the slightest hint of rebellion. Yet she carried herself with dignity, refusing to be treated as anything less than a queen. Her French attendants, the few who had stayed behind when her English ladies were dismissed, became her strongest support. They reminded her of who she was and guided her through the delicate balancing act she had to maintain. Madame Ducy, her chief lady, often told her, "Remember, you are still Queen of England in the eyes of the law and in your father's court. Henry wears the crown, but he has not broken your marriage or rejected the treaty. That is your strength. As long as you have value, you have hope." But hope came with a heavy shadow. Soon whispers began reaching Isabella about Richard's fate. First, she heard he had died in confinement at Pontefract Castle. Then darker rumors spread that his death had been arranged, not natural. When the news was finally confirmed, Isabella felt an ache sharper than she expected. She had never loved Richard as a husband, she was far too young, but he had been kind, protective, and the closest thing to a father figure she had since leaving France. His loss cut deeply, severing her last link to the life she had built in England. And worse, the way he had died served as a chilling warning of what her own future might hold. If Henry had been bold enough to arrange the death of a crowned king, what hope did a French princess have of being spared when she was no longer useful? Isabella's fears seemed justified when, in the early months of 1400, she was presented with a harsh choice. The new King's Council told her she could return home to France, but only if she agreed to recognize Henry as England's rightful ruler and give up any claim to the throne as Richard's widow. From Henry's point of view, it was a clever plan. If Isabella left willingly, it would look as though she accepted that her marriage to Richard had ended with his downfall. This freed Henry from the old treaty without having to openly cast out a child queen. For Isabella, the decision was crushing. She was just 10 years old, yet she was asked to choose between exile and imprisonment. Accepting would mean returning to her family, but admitting that her 3 years as queen had meant nothing. Refusing might trap her in the tower forever. Her French attendants were split. Some urged her to go back, believing she would be safer at her father's court and might even be married again one day. Others insisted she should resist, saying she was still Richard's true widow and the rightful Queen of England, no matter what Henry declared. Isabella wrestled with these choices for weeks. Part of her longed to escape Henry's cold, watchful court and see her parents again. Yet another part of her could not bear the thought of betraying Richard's memory or the peace he had tried so hard to create. In the end, her decision was taken out of her hands. Her father, King Charles VI, during one of his rare moments of clarity, sent firm instructions that his daughter must come home at once. The message was clear: if England delayed her return, France would take it as an act of war. Faced with that threat, Henry's government quickly allowed her to leave. The terms of her release were written so vaguely that both sides could spin the story however they wished. Either Isabella had chosen freely, or she had been forced out. Her journey back to France in the summer of 1401 was filled with mixed feelings. She was leaving behind the palace rooms where she had studied English poetry, the gardens where she had laughed with Margaret Holland, and the grand hall where she had once worn a crown too heavy for her young head. At the same time, she was heading toward a family she barely remembered. She now spoke French with a faint English accent, favored English clothing styles, and had to relearn how to move and speak according to French customs. The little girl who had left Paris at 6 returned as an 11-year-old, shaped by years of experiences no one at her father's court could truly understand. Her homecoming was far from simple. King Charles was lost in a deep spell of madness. When she arrived, screaming about invisible enemies and failing even to recognize his daughter. Weeks passed before he came back to his senses, and even then, he seemed bewildered by Isabella's presence, as if he had forgotten her marriage to Richard ever took place. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, was warmer in her welcome, but her mind was already turning toward politics. She quickly began to consider how her daughter's unusual status as the widow of an English king might be used to strengthen France's position in the years ahead. When Isabella returned to France, she quickly discovered that her years spent in England had changed the way people looked at her. She was no longer just a girl who had left home as a child bride. She had been Queen of England, had lived inside its royal court, and had watched closely how its politics worked. This made her valuable in ways she did not expect. Her knowledge of English leaders, castles, and armies meant she could answer questions no one else in France could. But instead of feeling proud, she often felt torn in two, by birth and by heart. She was French, yet England had been her home for nearly half her life. When her mother's advisors gathered around her to ask about English defenses or how loyal the nobles were to Henry, she had to choose her words carefully. She gave only safe answers, never so much detail that her words could be twisted into weapons, but never so little that she seemed unhelpful. It was a dangerous balance, and even at 11, she understood that every sentence could have consequences. Those first months back in Paris became a time of deep reflection for her. She was no longer the little girl who had left France at 6 years old, yet she was not grown up either. She had already endured more grief and danger than most adults ever did. People around her whispered about what her future might hold, and even she could not help but wonder. As the widow of a king, she was considered a rare prize in the game of European politics. Suitors from powerful families began circling, some dazzled by her title, others interested in the political doors that marrying her might open. Yet Isabella herself had grown more thoughtful about marriage. She remembered Richard's kindness and protection, but also the fragility of their bond, broken so quickly by Henry's rise. She had seen how marriages could give safety, but also how easily they could crumble when the winds of power shifted. If she was ever forced into another union, she wanted it to be with someone who respected her as more than just a symbol. She wanted to be valued for her intelligence, her dignity, and her voice. But the French court in 1401 was not a safe place for someone with complicated loyalties. The war with England stirred up hatred, and many nobles still viewed Isabella as suspicious. Because of her years as queen across the sea, some doubted whether she still carried secret sympathies for the English. At the same time, she felt genuine affection for Richard and for the people who had been part of her young life there. She could not simply erase them from her heart. Every day felt like walking on a narrow rope. One wrong step could make enemies on either side. To make matters worse, her father's worsening illness meant the French throne was effectively controlled by rival noble factions. Each group wanted to use Isabella's name and status to strengthen its own position. She had to learn quickly how to read their intentions, smile politely, and avoid being trapped as a pawn in their endless struggles. Her mother, Queen Isabeau, played both comforting protector and calculating strategist. On one hand, she loved Isabella and wanted her safe. On the other, she was a skilled political player who recognized her daughter's unusual position as an asset to France. Every gesture of kindness from Isabeau carried an unspoken expectation. Isabella must serve the crown's interests, even if they went against her own hopes or feelings. For a girl barely 11, this was a heavy weight to carry. The year 1402 brought even greater tension. News arrived that Henry IV's rule in England was crumbling. The once loyal Percy family had rebelled, uprisings had broken out in Wales, and trouble stirred in Scotland. At the French court, nobles began whispering eagerly that this was the perfect chance to invade England. Some went further, suggesting that Isabella should play a role in this plan, that her name, as Richard's widow, could rally English hearts against Henry and make France's cause seem just. To Isabella, the idea was terrifying. She had no wish to be the banner under which two nations bled. She thought often of the people she had known in England, not the rulers who schemed and fought, but the ordinary souls who had shown her kindness. The women who had taught her to speak English, the companions who had laughed with her in gardens, the servants who had cared for her as if she were their own child. To imagine French soldiers burning villages and harming those same people in her name made her feel sick inside. For days, she wrestled with the fear that she might be powerless to stop it. When the question finally came to her directly, would she support the idea of an invasion? She took a deep breath and chose her words with steady care. She told them that war would only bring sorrow, that villages would burn and countless lives would be lost. Whatever her feelings toward Henry, she could not bear the thought of such destruction, especially when her own name might be used to justify it. In this way, Isabella showed remarkable courage. She was still only a child, yet she was beginning to understand the heavy weight of her past and the even heavier expectations for her future. Isabella understood better than most that if France chose to invade, the English people would likely stand together, even if they disliked Henry as their ruler. Pride in defending their homeland, combined with their strong castles, skilled longbowmen, and naval power, made the outcome uncertain. She spoke against war when pressed for her opinion, explaining that victory was far from certain and blood would be spilled on both sides. Some at court bristled at her words, calling her loyalty into question, whispering that she had lived too long among the English. But not everyone condemned her. Several thoughtful advisors came to her defense, insisting that keeping peace was far more useful to France than rushing into another endless costly war. The debate over peace or war was still echoing through the halls of Paris when, in 1403, Isabella's life took a new turn. Messengers arrived from Charles, Duke of Orleans, her cousin, and one of the most powerful and influential men in France. They carried with them a formal marriage proposal that, if accepted, would once again change Isabella's role in European politics. Charles was 29 years old, the same age Richard had been at their wedding years earlier, but this time Isabella was nearly 14, standing on the edge of womanhood. The difference in years did not seem so daunting now, and the idea of this union sparked curiosity and hope. From the viewpoint of the French crown, the match was ideal. It kept Isabella securely within the royal family, making sure that no rival court could claim her as a prize or use her to undermine French interests. Politically, it tied her to one of the most refined courts in Europe, for Charles of Orleans was known not only as a capable leader on the battlefield, but also as a lover of books, poetry, and music. He surrounded himself with artists and scholars, and many whispered that his gatherings were as brilliant as any in Paris. For Isabella personally, the proposal offered more than just safety. It promised a chance for a partnership built on mutual respect, something she had longed for after the cold calculations of her first marriage. She remembered Charles from earlier visits. He had always shown her kindness, speaking to her with warmth, and never looking down on her as a mere child. Unlike Richard, who often seemed distant and lost in thought, Charles was lively and full of energy. He was a man who enjoyed conversation, who leaned forward when someone spoke, and who always seemed eager to hear new ideas. Isabella noticed these differences immediately when they met to speak about the proposal. Their conversations were filled with not only political matters, but also personal ones. Charles looked at her as if she were an equal, asking for her opinions and listening closely to her answers. The political background, however, made the negotiations delicate. England was still unsettled, and Henry's throne was far from secure. Rumors of rebellion spread constantly, and many believed his reign might collapse under the weight of unrest. If that happened, Isabella might be called back to England, perhaps even placed at the center of a new attempt to restore the old line. Both she and Charles knew this possibility lingered in the air, adding weight to every step of their courtship. But Charles did not shy away from the risks. In fact, he faced them directly. During one of their private conversations, Charles spoke. With surprising honesty, "I am not here to marry a title," he told her gently. "I don't wish for the Queen of England's widow. I wish to marry Isabella of Valois, the young woman who has walked through storms and still stands with dignity." His words startled her, for no one had ever spoken to her so directly before. For the first time in her life, she felt seen not as a symbol or a pawn, but as a person with her own heart and mind. At 14, Isabella felt emotions she had never truly known before. She was no longer a child to be guided and guarded, but a young woman discovering the stirrings of affection and hope. Charles was not only handsome and well-educated, but he treated her with a kind of respect that was rare in the halls of power. He made her feel valued for who she was, not just for what she represented. In his presence, she began to imagine a future that might hold something more than duty and sacrifice. Once both families agreed to the terms, the negotiations moved quickly. Isabella brought with her the weight of her royal name, her experience as a former Queen of England, and the valuable connections she still held across Europe. Charles, in return, promised her safety, influence, and a life at the very heart of France's political and cultural world. Their wedding was arranged for June 1406 at the great Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. The ceremony was nothing like Isabella's first marriage to Richard, which had been little more than a formal arrangement wrapped in stiff ritual. This time, the day was filled with music, with colorful banners waving above the crowd, with chants and prayers that echoed through the soaring cathedral arches. The air buzzed with celebration rather than quiet formality. As Isabella walked down the long aisle, dressed in rich fabrics that glittered in the candlelight, she no longer felt like a frightened child caught in the gears of politics. She felt like a young woman stepping into a new chapter with a partner who saw her as more than a symbol. For the first time, marriage offered not just duty, but the possibility of love. The wedding was planned as a dazzling display meant to show off the wealth and strength of the French crown. Isabella, now 16, looked radiant in a flowing gown of rich blue silk decorated with golden designs. A delicate crown of sapphires and pearls rested on her dark hair, making her appear every inch the royal bride. She walked down the cathedral's long aisle with steady steps, no longer the frightened little girl once married off to a stranger, but a young woman ready to shape her own future. At the altar, Charles stood proudly in his finest robes, his smile full of genuine warmth rather than cold politics. When the two spoke their vows, their voices carried across the hall, strong and certain. People whispered afterward that the couple's eyes had stayed locked on each other, showing real affection instead of just duty. The celebrations that followed filled Paris with joy and splendor. Singers and musicians performed songs praising the pair, while actors staged plays about love overcoming hardships. Banquets overflowed with food, and the finest wine poured freely into every cup. For the first time in years, Isabella allowed herself to relax, laughing and joining in the merriment. Unlike in England, where she had always felt like an outsider, here she felt truly at home. The French court welcomed her not as a failed queen, but as a woman who had endured hardships and returned wiser and stronger. The first years of her life with Charles were some of the happiest she had ever known. He was more than a loving husband. He was also someone she could talk to about ideas, music, and books. Their home in Blois soon turned into a lively gathering place for poets, scholars, and artists from across Europe. Isabella threw herself into this cultural life with passion. She supported storytellers, ordered the making of beautiful illustrated books, set up a workshop where monks carefully copied important writings, and even exchanged letters with great thinkers beyond France. Her time in England gave her a broader view of the world, and she used that experience to bring people and ideas together. Her role grew beyond that of a duchess meant to smile at ceremonies. Charles trusted her judgment and valued her knowledge, especially about England, but he also leaned on her for advice in the daily affairs of their lands. Isabella was no longer just a symbolic figure. She was becoming a real partner in leadership. In 1407, their first child was born, a daughter they named Jean. Isabella embraced motherhood with the same energy she brought to everything else. She refused to follow custom and let nurses raise the baby, insisting on caring for Jean herself. When doctors warned that breastfeeding was unworthy of a duchess, Isabella stood firm. Holding her baby girl, she felt a deep joy she had never known before. She whispered soft promises in both French and English, vowing that Jean would grow up with freedom, love, and choices she herself had been denied as a child. The baby's arrival only drew Isabella and Charles closer together. Charles adored his daughter, often slipping into the nursery to read to her or simply watch her sleep. Isabella sometimes found him sitting quietly by the cradle, marveling at the tiny life they had created. Their little family felt like a safe haven in a world full of uncertainty. But outside their private joy, the wider world was far from peaceful. Across the Channel, England was still restless, with Henry IV facing uprisings and fierce opposition. Closer to home, France was increasingly unstable as the king's illness left the throne vulnerable, and powerful nobles began to clash over who would control the kingdom. Isabella, even in her happiness, could feel the shadow of these troubles creeping toward her door. Isabella's father-in-law, Louis of Orleans, was one of the most determined men in France. As the king's brother, he believed it was his duty to take control whenever King Charles VI fell into one of his unstable periods. But his authority was bitterly challenged by the Duke of Burgundy, who had his own followers and his own ambitions for the kingdom. At first, to Isabella, these rivalries felt like the endless quarrels that always seemed to circle around royal families. She tried to keep her distance, focusing on her children, her household, and her love of books and music, while leaving the plotting and scheming to others. That illusion of safety ended in November 1407. On a cold evening, Louis was ambushed in Paris and murdered by Burgundian men. The killing shocked the city, carried out so boldly in broad daylight that no one could mistake the message. The king's own brother had been cut down in the streets, and his killers slipped away into the crowded alleys. News of the murder spread like wildfire, and Isabella's world shifted overnight. With his father gone, her husband Charles suddenly became the head of the Orleans family. This gave him great power, but it also placed a target firmly on his back. The Duke of Burgundy had shown he would not hesitate to strike at his enemies. And now Charles was next in line. For Isabella, life became filled with watchfulness and fear. She was surrounded by bodyguards, her movements were carefully restricted, and even her letters were checked before they were sent. What had once been a lively, artistic court at Bleuot was replaced by whispers of danger, locked doors, and constant suspicion. Charles himself was deeply changed by his father's death. The gentle, thoughtful young man Isabella had fallen in love with began to harden. His grief turned into a burning need for revenge, and his conversations were often filled with talk of allies, soldiers, and strategies. Isabella still loved him and stood beside him, but there were moments when his intensity frightened her. She had lived through political violence before, and she feared France was headed toward the same kind of endless bloodshed that had once torn England apart. In 1408, there was at least a moment of peace when Isabella gave birth to their second child, a boy named Charles. The baby's arrival brought hope and joy, but also new worries. A male heir strengthened the Orleans family's claim, yet it also made them an even greater prize for their enemies. Isabella poured her heart into motherhood. She wanted her son to grow up with not just privilege, but also strength of character. She carefully chose his tutors, insisted he learn several languages, and made sure he studied the histories of kingdoms and rulers. She wanted him to grow into a man who could navigate power without losing his compassion. All the while, the kingdom slid closer to civil war. Sieges, raids, and skirmishes wore down both sides, leaving towns in ruins and families broken. While Charles was away leading men into battle, Isabella carried heavy responsibilities at home. She managed estates, negotiated with allies, and organized supplies for the troops. The young woman who had once seemed like a quiet queen in waiting now revealed herself as a capable leader. She balanced diplomacy and firmness, using both kindness and resolve to keep her family's land secure. Through these years, Isabella lived with constant fear, but also with remarkable strength. She had been a child bride in England, a queen, stripped of her crown, and now a duchess standing at the edge of a civil war. Each step of her life had forced her to grow, and now she was proving that she could not only survive, but also guide others in the darkest of times. During this period, Isabella's letters show a remarkable transformation. She was no longer the hesitant young girl who had been shuffled between foreign courts, unsure of her place. Instead, she had grown into a woman who understood her responsibilities and could take charge of her own life. The war had left France in chaos. Entire villages were burned or looted, farms were ruined, and families lived in fear as soldiers from both sides roamed freely, taking what they wanted. Markets were disrupted, trade slowed, and ordinary people faced hunger and hardship every day. Isabella used every opportunity she could to ease their suffering. She established charitable programs, negotiated safe paths for refugees, and worked tirelessly to make sure food and shelter reached those who needed it most. Her actions won her admiration across the country. People no longer saw her only as the Duchess of Orleans. She was recognized as a compassionate, practical leader who cared about the lives of common citizens. The arrival of her third child in 1409, a daughter named Margaret, brought both joy and worry. At 20 years old, Isabella was aware that repeated pregnancies were dangerous, and she approached this one with great caution. She followed the advice of the best physicians she could find and made detailed plans for the care of all her children in case her health failed. Those preparations were wise. During Margaret's birth, serious complications nearly claimed her life. She lost a dangerous amount of blood and battled infection, teetering on the edge of death for several tense days. Charles stayed constantly at her side, and messengers raced across Europe to request prayers for her recovery. Facing the threat of death forced both Isabella and Charles to confront the fragile nature of their happiness and the uncertain future of their children. Isabella survived, but her health remained fragile for years. Doctors warned that another pregnancy could be fatal, which dramatically affected her relationship with Charles. Their love remained strong, but physical intimacy became cautious, always measured against the risk of conception. Isabella, who had once embraced the joys of closeness and passion, now had to restrain herself for the sake of survival. Despite these limits, she and Charles discovered new ways to express love and partnership. They shared in the management of their lands, supported each other's interests in art and culture, and worked together on political matters. Isabella became deeply involved in the governance of their territories, practically serving as co-ruler while Charles campaigned against the Burgundians. She managed logistics, organized supplies, maintained alliances, and made crucial decisions that kept their forces effective, showing remarkable intelligence and leadership. By 1410, the situation in France became even more dangerous. The Duke of Burgundy was secretly negotiating with England, hoping to draw Henry IV into the French Civil War. Isabella was alarmed. She remembered the destruction that foreign intervention could bring, and she feared that France would suffer even more as a result. Using her unique experience as a former Queen of England, she began secret communications with the English court. Through intermediaries, she tried to persuade Henry IV that joining the French conflict would be costly, dangerous, and ultimately unsuccessful. Many in England still viewed her with suspicion, but Isabella persisted, determined to prevent large-scale warfare. These efforts highlighted her evolution from a frightened young bride into a skilled, strategic, and compassionate leader. She balanced concern for her family and her people with the harsh realities of political conflict, showing courage, intelligence, and resilience in the face of constant danger. Throughout these years, Isabella had to navigate the complexities of motherhood, marriage, and civil war. Her responsibilities as a leader and as a mother often collided, yet she handled them with remarkable care. She oversaw her children's education personally, selecting tutors and ensuring that they learned languages, history, and diplomacy skills they would need to survive in a divided and dangerous world. She watched over her children while Charles was away, coordinating reinforcements and supplies to support his campaigns. She became a stabilizing force in a country torn by violence, offering hope, compassion, and practical leadership in a time when both were desperately needed. Isabella had come to realize that her true value wasn't just in her royal blood or the power of her family connections, but in her sharp ability to read the currents of European politics and to craft plans that helped multiple people at once. She grew increasingly respected across France and beyond, not only for managing her husband's territories, but for offering insights on wider matters of state. People trusted her judgment because she had experience in navigating the tricky world of courts and diplomacy, and she consistently showed skill in balancing competing interests. Even as her influence grew, Isabella's body was slowly weakening. The difficulties from giving birth to her daughter Margarita had left her with fragile lungs and constant fatigue, and daily routines became exhausting. She often retreated to quiet reflection and prayer, aware of the limits her body now imposed. Yet despite these challenges, her mind stayed sharp. She oversaw her children's education, kept a close eye on political decisions, and maintained her cultural passions. Her resilience and determination to live purposefully, even while ill, inspired everyone around her. In 1409, a temporary hope emerged when early peace talks were arranged between the Orleans and Burgundian factions. Isabella used her diplomacy to help bring the sides closer, offering guidance that showed fairness and understanding. Though the negotiations eventually broke down, her efforts were praised widely, and she earned a reputation as a wise and capable mediator who could handle delicate conflicts. Her work demonstrated not only political maturity, but also a deep commitment to preventing needless suffering in her country. As months passed, her health grew more serious. Her chronic respiratory issues worsened, and she began wasting away from the illness that would eventually take her life, likely tuberculosis, though physicians at the time could only watch helplessly as her strength declined. Still, Isabella faced the possibility of death with remarkable courage. She prepared detailed instructions to protect and educate her children and worked to safeguard her husband's political standing, knowing that her absence might encourage rival factions. Even in her final days, she insisted on continuing her daily routines as much as her weakened body allowed, refusing to let illness define her or burden her loved ones. Her bravery in these moments became legendary, sparking stories, songs, and admiration that would live on long after her passing. On September 13, 1409, Isabella of Valois died at just 20 years old, leaving behind a life that had stretched across 3 kingdoms and included 2 marriages filled with both great joy and political turmoil. Her death brought sorrow throughout Europe, affecting not only family and subjects, but also countless people who had been touched by her intelligence, kindness, and dedication. The funeral procession to the Celestin convent in Paris, was one of the largest and most solemn ever seen in medieval France. Leaders and dignitaries traveled from across the continent to honor a woman who had combined personal courage with political wisdom in a way that defined her era. Charles of Orleans, devastated by the loss of his beloved wife and trusted advisor, grieved deeply. Though he would eventually marry again, Isabella and the life they had shared remained an unshakable memory, a testament to a love and partnership that had shaped both their lives and the future of their territories. Isabella's children grew up carrying forward the lessons their mother had taught them. Her son Charles would later be celebrated for his poetry and love of the arts, while her daughters made smart marriages that helped strengthen the family's position in France. Each of them carried with them Isabella's values, bravery, kindness, and the idea that power should be used to help others. Her death shook the political world. Without her calming presence, the battles between the Orlandan and Burgundian factions grew even harsher, and the fragile peace she had worked so hard to maintain slipped further away. France continued to be torn apart by these conflicts for many years, yet Isabella's influence stretched far beyond politics. She had shown that, even in a time when women were expected to stay in the background, it was possible to take initiative, lead with principle, and make a difference. Her courage and intelligence became a model for other women who wanted to push boundaries and take active roles in public life. Historians sometimes struggle to make sense of her story. By today's standards, her marriage at 6 to a man much older feels shocking and unfair, and it's hard to reconcile with modern ideas about childhood and consent. But judging her life only by modern norms misses the human reality of her story. Isabella was born into a world where royal children were treated as tools of diplomacy, yet she rose above those limitations and built a life full of meaning. Her marriages, even if arranged for political reasons, eventually became partnerships based on respect and affection. The violence, political chaos, and constant danger of her time were not the result of personal failings, but of a world where survival and power were always at stake. Isabella managed to navigate these challenges while staying true to her values, showing remarkable resilience and compassion. Her story reminds us that history isn't just about armies and rulers, it's about the people living through those events and the choices they made. Isabella refused to be only a victim of circumstance. She shaped her own life and created a legacy that outlived the political struggles of her era. Looking back, we can see both the limits and the possibilities that her life reveals. She faced strict expectations because of her gender and her status, yet she found ways to act independently and leave a meaningful mark on the world. Her life was a story of intelligence, strength, and the belief that personal happiness and responsibility to others could exist together. The medieval world she lived in was harsh and unforgiving. Life was short, childhood barely existed, and political alliances were often sealed at a terrible human cost. Still, within these limits, Isabella found ways to bring beauty, kindness, and connection into her life. Her legacy is not one of suffering, but of triumph over circumstances that might have crushed anyone less determined. Ultimately, Isabella's story shows that every era has its own moral challenges, but the people of the past shared our human need for love, safety, and purpose. To understand her life is to understand something universal about being human. We are shaped by our time, yet capable of rising above the restrictions it places on us. Isabella's life remains a testament to courage, intelligence, and the enduring human spirit.